Hey everyone, and welcome. We walk around with our beliefs feeling like we've got a pretty good grip on reality. But what if the maps we're using? Well, what if they're leading us astray? That's what we're diving into today. Beliefs, ideologies, those sneaky ways our thinking gets shaped. We've got a whole stack of fascinating articles, lectures, you name it, all about this. And, well, let's just say it's going to be a wild ride. So we're kicking things off with a question, and it might ruffle some feathers. Imagine those champions of logic, philosophers, those folks who dedicate their lives to clear thinking. What if, and stick with me here, what if they're just as susceptible to bias as the rest of us? Yeah, buckle up. Back in the late 1800s, there was this American philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce. Sounds a bit stuffy, but trust me, this guy's ideas were anything but. He wrote this paper called The Fixation of Belief, and it's still making waves today. Basically, he breaks down the ways we form beliefs into 4 different methods.
It's a framework for understanding, really, how we arrive at any conviction, right? Whether it's something mundane or a big life question.
Exactly. And the first method, Peirce calls it tenacity.
Yeah, it's like picture someone being, well, tenacious, digging their heels in.
Right.
It's that I'm sticking to my guns no matter what kind of thinking.
We've all been there, right? But I think we can all think of a time when, well, let's just say that approach didn't exactly lead us to the most accurate conclusion.
Right. Okay, so then there's authority. Pretty self-explanatory, right? We're taking someone else's word for it. It could be your parents, a mentor, even a news source you trust.
And historically speaking, authority has been a major player in shaping beliefs. Think about the influence of, like, religious institutions or, political regimes. Makes sense. Okay, so method number 3, Peirce calls this a priori, which, and I'll admit I had to look this one up, basically means we believe something because it just feels intuitively right.
Yeah, it's that gut feeling, like it just makes sense based on what you already know, even if you haven't really put it to the test.
Like that aha moment, even if you haven't quite connected all the dots.
But here's where Peirce throws a bit of a curveball. His 4th method, the one he really champions, is the method of science.
And this is where Peirce's pragmatism really shines through. He's saying, look, science, with all its experiments, questioning assumptions, being open to being wrong, that's the most reliable path to truth we've got. It's like realizing your favorite shortcut actually takes you further away from where you want to go. A bit disorienting at first, but ultimately it gets you where you need to be. But this brings up a really big question, and it's something we're going to really dig into today. If science is this amazing tool for getting us closer to truth, why do so many people still hold on to beliefs that, well, to put it gently, don't quite hold up under scrutiny?
Yeah, that's a real head scratcher, isn't it? And that's where this whole ideology thing comes in. It's like this, I don't know, invisible force field or something, just subtly messing with our beliefs, even when we think we're being like totally objective.
Okay, so let's unpack this ideology thing a bit. Where did this idea even come from?
Well, the word itself, you can trace it back to this French philosopher, Destutt de Tracy, back in the late 1700s. He saw it as kind of like a science of ideas, a way to study how thoughts bubble up and influence society. Pretty neutral,
Yeah, seems pretty straightforward. So what happened?
Well, then Marx and Engels came along in the mid-1800s and kind of turned the whole thing on its head. In their book, The German Ideology, they're like, hold on a minute. Ideology is not neutral at all. They saw it as a tool, right? A tool used by those in power, the ruling class, to keep things exactly as they are.
So not just some harmless science of ideas anymore.
Not exactly. Marx uses this metaphor, a camera obscura, to explain how it works. It's this old-timey device, projects an image, but flips it upside down. He's saying ideology does that to our view of reality, distorts it, makes us see the world in a way that benefits, well, the folks calling the shots.
So it's like we think we're looking through a clear window, but it's more like one of those funhouse mirrors.
Right, yeah.
Totally warped reflection.
Yeah, exactly. And for Marx, the key to breaking free from this funhouse mirror, it's about uncovering the material conditions, the stuff that's actually shaping our beliefs behind the scenes. He's all about looking beyond the surface, to those economic structures and power dynamics that are really pulling the strings.
So it's not just about changing our minds, it's about changing the whole system that's influencing our thinking in the first place.
Exactly. And this whole ideology conversation, it doesn't end there. Thinkers like Karl Mannheim, writing in the early 1900s, they broadened the definition even further. In his book, Ideology and Utopia, he's arguing ideology isn't just about class struggle. It's about the shared worldview of, like, a whole era.
So, like, no matter your social status, we're all swimming in the same soup of ideas.
Exactly. Mannheim's saying everyone's influenced by the dominant ideas of their time. whether they realize it or not. It's like the air we breathe. We don't really see it, but it's there, shaping everything.
Okay, this is really making me think about all the subtle ways our beliefs get shaped by the world around us.
And you can't talk about ideology without mentioning Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist. He was actually imprisoned by the fascist regime back in the 1920s and 30s, and some of his most important writing came out of that experience, his prison notebooks.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. They're like required reading if you want to understand power dynamics, right?
Absolutely. Gramsci, he brings in this concept of hegemony, which is basically a way for dominant groups to stay on top, but not just through brute force, but through getting people to go along with it, consent, subtle persuasion, that sort of thing.
So it's less about like overt control and more about shaping what folks see as normal, acceptable.
Right. He argues that institutions like schools, churches, the media, they're all part of this process, subtly shaping our values, making us believe this is just the way things are, natural, even desirable.
It's like we're being nudged toward a certain way of seeing the world without even realizing it.
Easy to miss, right? And Gramsci would say that's exactly why it's such an effective form of, well, control. Think about something like fashion trends, for example.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What does fashion have to do with all of this? Okay, now you've got me curious. What does fashion have to do with all of this?
Well, think about it, right? When you're getting dressed in the morning, you might think, oh, I'm just expressing my own unique style. But we're all influenced by trends, right?
True.
What's considered cool, what everyone else is wearing, even just wanting to fit in. Gramsci would say it's kind of the same with those bigger systems, like economic systems. We're subtly persuaded to just accept them as, well, that's just how things are, even if it's not really the best for everyone.
Wow, yeah, that's a really interesting parallel. I'd never thought about it that way before. Like those ideas about what's normal, they're working on us in all these different ways, even when it comes to something as, I don't know, seemingly simple as clothes.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? How do we start to see through those ideological lenses, engage with the world in a more conscious way?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And luckily, there are plenty of thinkers out there who can give us some directions. One of them is Louis Althusser. He's a Marxist philosopher, mid-20th century. And he really ran with this idea of ideology being like baked into those everyday things, the institutions we encounter.
Okay, I'm listening. How's Althusser's view different from what we've talked about so far?
Well, Marx, he focused on how ideology shapes what's going on in our heads, our thoughts, our beliefs. Althusser, he shifts the focus to what we do, those material practices. He'd say it's not just about what we think, but how we're, trained to act, to behave within these systems. And he's got this really interesting concept called interpolation. Basically, it's that moment when we respond to a call, and embrace a certain identity.
So like we're being hailed by a voice and we're like, oh yeah, that's me. I'm thinking about how we respond to being called a citizen, a consumer, a voter. Those labels come with expectations, right? And we just kind of internalize them without even realizing it.
Exactly. Those everyday moments, those little acts of identification. For Althusser, that's ideology at work, shaping our behavior, how we see ourselves in relation to, well, everything.
Okay, now that's a powerful insight. And maybe a little unnerving when you really sit with it. It's like we're always already caught up in these webs of meaning, even when we think we're acting totally freely.
And that brings us to another big name, Slavoj Žižek. He's a Slovenian philosopher known for being, well, let's just say he's not afraid to stir the pot. And he's got this really interesting take on how ideology and, get this, fantasy all fit together.
Oh yeah, I've heard of him. The Elvis of cultural theory, right?
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
Žižek, he's all about shaking things up. And one of his big arguments is that we're not just like these empty vessels being filled up by ideology. We're active participants in creating it and keeping it going. And fantasy. Fantasy is a big part of how that happens, he says.
Okay, I think I'm going to need you to unpack this fantasy thing a bit. What's Zizek getting at here?
So he's drawing on the work of Jacques Lacan. He was a French psychoanalyst. And his big thing was that our sense of self, our whole understanding of the world, it's all filtered through language, symbols, all of that. It's not just about being told what to think. It's those stories we tell ourselves about the world, about what we want, what we're afraid of, those fantasies we cook up to make sense of it all,
So like those daydreams we have, right? The perfect job, the ideal partner, that life where everything just clicks into place. Those are all fantasies, in a way, when you think about it.
Exactly. And those fantasies, even though they seem really personal, individual, they're often shaped by, you guessed it, the dominant ideologies floating around. Think about advertising, right? All those ads playing on our desires, our anxieties, selling us a vision of happiness that's always just out of reach.
It's like that feeling you get when you get a brand new phone. All the excitement, the possibilities, but then a few weeks later, that feeling's gone, right? And you're on to the next upgrade.
Exactly. Zizek calls that the cycle of desire fueled by fantasy. We're chasing those little bursts of satisfaction, but they're always fleeting because, well, they're based on an illusion, a fantasy of wholeness, completion, that, let's face it, you're never going to fully grasp.
This is all making a lot of sense, but it's also, I don't know, a little daunting. Like, if our desires are that easy to manipulate, if we're all stuck in these webs of ideology and fantasy, is there any hope of ever really breaking free?
That's where it gets really interesting. Ishik's not saying we should just throw our hands up and say, well, we're doomed. He actually sees understanding this stuff, ideology, fantasy, all of it, as the first step to actually making things better, creating a more just, equitable world.
So it's not just about recognizing the problem, it's about, what, doing something with that knowledge.
Exactly. And it starts with asking some tough questions. What are those unexamined beliefs I'm carrying around? Those assumptions that are shaping my worldview? What about those fantasies that are driving my decisions, my actions? These are questions we all need to sit with, to wrestle with, if we want something better for ourselves, for the future.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We started with this simple question about how we form beliefs, and then bam, we're down the rabbit hole, exploring ideology, fantasy, the whole works.
And I hope our listeners will walk away from this with some new tools, some new ways of thinking about the world and their place in it. Because at the end of the day, it's about realizing we're not just along for the ride. We have the power to shape the direction, to create a reality that's more just, more equitable, more fulfilling for everyone.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, keep those questions coming, keep those conversations going, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.